All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for signing up for this talk. Eleanor's going to be here for a little while to answer any technical difficulties that you may have. Hopefully, it'll work fine. It's going to be pretty simple, hopefully. But without further ado, I'm going to get started. So I'm going to be talking about remnant prairies and grassland restoration in the Mid-Atlantic Piedmont. So to outline the talk, I'm going to start by giving a brief introduction to the Clifton Institute. Then I'll talk about our research on remnant Piedmont prairies, then the Native Seed Project, then our grassland restoration experiment, and finally some thoughts on meadow establishment. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We have 7 full-time staff. We're funded by individual donations and foundation grants. And our 3 program areas are education, restoration, and research. And our mission is to inspire a deeper understanding and appreciation of nature, to study the ecology of our region, to restore habitat, and to conserve native biodiversity. And as many of y'all know, we're located about an hour west of Washington, D.C. in Fauquier County. And we have a wide range of habitats on the property, and we're running an iNaturalist project to catalog all the species that we find on the property. And this moth, Synanthodon richard's eye, is one of the highlights from a few years ago. This was a really rare moth that mimics wasps, and apparently its host plant is viburnum, but no one seems to know for sure. So there's a lot to learn out there, even here just an hour away from the nation's capital. In terms of how we're managing the land, we prioritize our management based on declining species. These are the species that need the most help. And that's led us to work a lot on grasslands and shrublands because that's where the declining species are most common. And we work to control non-native plants and to establish native plants to benefit all biodiversity. We also have a landowner outreach program where we visit landowners in our area to advise on land management, also public lands managers, and we focus on grasslands and meadows. We have so far visited about 300 landowners who manage 20,000 acres. And you can see in about a 15 county area. And if you're interested in this, send Kadira an email and we can set up a free property visit. For education, we do field trips for local schools, as well as summer camps, and our programs are research-based. So we're teaching kids how to collect data and how science is done. And one of our recent projects that we've just started is Lawn Lab, and we have convinced one of the local schools to stop mowing one of their sports fields, and we're working with the students to measure how that affects the plants and insects. For research, so I'm going to be talking about our grassland research tonight, but briefly, we're also studying American kestrels. This is North America's smallest falcon that's declining across the Northeast. And we are tracking them with GPS transmitters to understand what kinds of habitats they require and also where their food is most abundant. We're also tracking box turtles. It's thought that in rural areas like out here, that mowing is just as important as roadkill in terms of affecting the population, but there's very little research on the effects of mowing on box turtles and no recommendations for landowners on how they can time their mowing. So that's what we're working on with them. We are also doing an experimental restoration of forest understories, where we're comparing the effects of prescribed fire and deer exposures at restoring wildflowers in the understory. And so as I hope you can see, our research is very applied. We only take on our project if it's going to have if the results are going to have clear implications for landowners. Okay, so that's it for the introduction. So on to our research on remnant prairies. First, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, especially Jordan Kasha, Hannah Liz, and Rachel Harrington. They were students working with us. Leighton Reed, Amy Johnson, Charlotte Lorick, Devin Floyd, and Carrie Nee have also played important roles in all this research. And before I dive into our project, just wanted to go over some terminology because there's a lot of terms flying around like prairie or a grassland. Um, and this is how you define it. So prairies have less than 10% canopy cover. Savannas are 10 to 25%. And then woodlands, which are open forests, have between 25 and 60% roughly canopy cover. And greater than that, you would call a closed canopy forest. And it turns out that grasslands are not just prairies. So grasslands are any habitat that are dominated by grasses and wildflowers in terms of percent cover or biomass. And so grasslands include savannas and open woodlands. And for the purposes of this talk, when I say meadow, I'm referring to a planted grassland. Now, this is what we're all taught in school. So prairies grow up into shrublands, grow up into forests, and forests are the climax community. That's the goal. And then disturbance, which we usually don't like, resets the clock. But this is an outdated view. And yeah, in addition to calling forest climax habitats, prairies and shrublands have been called early successional habitats. But I want you to imagine a late successional grassland. This is a mature grassland that has been here for hundreds or thousands of years. And this grassland has really high plant diversity. And there's a lot of conservative plant species found here. These are species that are poor dispersers and that live a long time, and they're not good at colonizing new sites. And this grassland is made of mostly native plants. And then you can imagine that if you have regular fire and grazing, it will keep this habitat from turning into forest, and it will maintain the mature, high diversity grassland. But you can also imagine if you remove that disturbance, then the grassland will grow up into a closed canopy forest, and all that shade is going to reduce the plant diversity. But at least for a while, there's going to be an intact bud bank and seed bank. And so seed bank is the viable seeds in the soil. Bud bank is when you have the plants are still there, but there's just a few leaves. You might not even see them, but they're waiting for their opportunity when the canopy is opened up. And so you can imagine if we thinned this forest and burned it, we could bring it back to a really diverse, mature grassland. But unfortunately, most of the grasslands that we see nowadays are early successional grasslands. These are ones that have low plant diversity. They're dominated by non-native plants. They include a lot of ruderal plant species. These are plants that are good dispersers that produce a lot of seeds and they're short-lived. And we are all searching for a way to restore early successional grasslands and turn them into mature grasslands, so high diversity, lots of native plants. But this has still not been done. No one has successfully converted a really disturbed early successional grassland into a high quality grassland. And the way you do the other way around is by plowing it. So once you've disturbed the soil significantly, you may never be able to get it back. And if you are, it probably takes at least 500 years. So, but how do you know if you've got one of these? So early successional grasslands are characterized by broom sedge. That's a really good indicator, as well as beak panic grass and species like common milkweed and tall goldenrod. In contrast, late successional grasslands are dominated by little blue stem and a lot of different wildflowers, such as early goldenrod, slender bush clover, and clasping milkweed. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about Piedmont grasslands, and the Piedmont is an area that stretches from Alabama to New Jersey, and it's sandwiched in between the Blue Ridge Mountains and the coastal plain, which is defined by the fall line. And sometimes people say, "What's the big deal? There's lots of grasslands out there. What's the worry?" And the fact is that they look like this. So they are dominated by tall fescue and other non-native cool season pasture grasses. They're also manicured, and so they are poor wildlife habitat. So I mentioned tall fescue, this grass. was planted for forage for cattle pastures and hay fields. And it's a really aggressive grass that has outcompeted most other plants in our area. And fescue now covers almost 50 million acres in the eastern US. On top of that, its seeds are mildly toxic to birds. So scientists always like to test these kinds of things out, and they fed seeds to juncos and found that they lost weight. The other thing about fescue, this is an unmowed fescue field in the winter, and you can see that when you get any snow, it's going to cover it up, and there's going to be nothing left for sparrows. There's going to be no structure. But on the other hand, it's really dense, and so baby quail have trouble walking through it. So fescue really is not good for wildlife. But when I moved to Virginia about 10 years ago, I noticed that yes, there's a lot of fescue, but also most of these fescue fields have native plants in them somewhere. And so in this field, you can see Indian grass in the back left corner there. This is a nice stand of local ecotype Indian grass that nobody planted and it's just hanging out there. And I also started looking around and checked out my neighbor's fields and found that he had this amazing assortment of wildflowers growing in his field. And he had never planted anything out there. So there were just these wildflowers just on their own, which is really interesting. And then I looked at Clifton, and this is an old cattle pasture that was grazed up until the 1970s. Um, but since then, we bush hog it every couple of years, and that's it. And there's a really nice assortment of wildflowers and grasses out there as well. So I started looking into it, and these grasslands, there's actually a lot of evidence that these native grasslands have been around for a long time. So this is a map by the explorer John Lederer from 1670. And you can see in the Piedmont of Virginia and North Carolina, he's labeled a huge area as savanna. Also, John Smith, well before this, like right around 1600, documented that the Manahoac native people were burning constantly, and they wouldn't walk through a forest unless it had been burned. So fires set by Native Americans, as well as fires from lightning strikes, maintain these grasslands, as well as grazing from bison and from the megafauna before them. And so, information is fragmentary, but we look at the data sources that we can. And this is a model that estimated the fire frequency from 1650 to 1850. And you can see that based on fire scars and climate data, this paper predicted that most of Virginia would have burned every 4 to 6 years. And that would have been plenty frequent, given the severity and the time of year. That would have been plenty frequent to maintain a lot of savannas. Now, so I mentioned bison. This is a historic range map of bison, and it shows that they were found throughout the Piedmont of Virginia, and they disappeared around 1730. This is further backed up by bones in the southern Piedmont, as well as explorers' accounts of bison in Washington, D.C. And now, if we lived in the glaciated Northeast, all we would have to do to figure out to reconstruct historical plant communities would be to look at pollen cores in old lakes. But unfortunately, in Virginia, we only have two natural lakes, and neither of them produce the kind of pollen cores that we need to figure out what the plant communities look like. So we've had to get creative, and Alexander Krings from NC State published this study just a couple of years ago, and it's really exciting. So he took soil cores from a couple of remnant prairies in North Carolina, and first he carbon dated the soil cores to see how old the soil was. And then he looked at the ratio of carbon isotopes in the cores to determine if the plant communities were dominated by grasses or by other plants that don't use a C4 photosynthetic pathway. And indeed, he found that these two grasslands had native warm season grasses in them for at least the last 2,000 years. So this is a really interesting technology, and we are applying for funding to try to apply this in Virginia. But so this is what we think the savannas would have looked like. This is Fort Barfoot, where they do frequent artillery practice and they set the whole place on fire all the time. And this is a savanna where there are widely spaced post oaks and a really diverse community of grasses and wildflowers in the understory. So we don't think there would have been a lot of huge prairies in the Virginia Piedmont. We think that it would have looked like this mostly. But you can see there's plenty of sun hitting the ground to maintain these diverse plant communities. But so where are all the native grasslands? You probably know the answers to this. So fire suppression and afforestation, as well as plowing for crops, invasion of cool season pasture grasses, and other non-natives, and urban development have all taken their toll on native grasslands. Okay, but so what is there to learn about northern Piedmont grasslands? So I started looking, and there has been some research from the Southern Virginia Piedmont. There's a study of one site down there where they found a really diverse community of 108 species of plants, as well as a bunch of rare and threatened plants. This is under a power line. Um, but other than that, there was almost nothing had been done on the grasslands in the northern and central Piedmont of Virginia. And I've got to point out that the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation is still deprioritizing research on northern and central Piedmont prairies. And they say because of their semi-natural status, vegetation in this group is not a high priority for future research, but it is valuable as a reference for restoration. And so I think this is wrong and respectfully disagree with my colleagues there. And hopefully you'll see why as I present the results here. So our research questions were what plants are characteristic of northern and central Piedmont grasslands? What is the conservation status of native grasslands in our region? And how should we protect and restore these habitats? So together with our partners at the Piedmont Discovery Center and the Restoration Ecology Lab at Virginia Tech, we identified 132 study sites in the northern and central Piedmont. And most of these sites are in power line clearings. Some of them are in old fields, so they haven't been too abused by the cows or the haying. And some of them were probably never plowed. It seems like when we look at the soil, they've never been plowed. And this is because the soil is so terrible at there that they're not suitable for agriculture. But they still support amazing communities of native plants. So we sampled 50 by 2 meter plots with nested 1 by 1 meter plots where we did more detailed surveys within the plot. And we found 737 plant species. And it turned out that these are the most diverse plant communities in the entire state. We found up to 123 plant species per 100 square meters and up to 41 species per 1 square meter. The maximum that's been observed in tallgrass prairies is 28 species in a 1 by 1 meter plot. So the Midwestern prairies get all the attention, but these Piedmont prairies are a lot richer. And it's not just a bunch of non-native weeds out there. 86% of the plants that we found are native. And just to show a few examples, this is on Thoroughfare Road in Prince William County. We discovered this site while driving down the road and seeing some blooming rose pink. And it turned out this is the most diverse plant community in all of Northern Virginia. This is on Ritchie Road in southern Fauquier County. Really cool site with grass leaf blazing star. And this is on Raccoon Ford in Culpeper County. This does not look very inspiring from the road. Just looks like some weeds maybe growing under a little power line surrounded by forest. Uh, but this is a really diverse site with several rare plants. And one of the interesting things about this area is that the forest has a lot of post oaks and blackjack oaks in it. And it's a short and scrubby forest that really ought to be a savanna. Post oaks are a full sun oak species, and they are going to die eventually getting shaded out in this area. So really what needs to happen here is thinning and burning to restore the savanna before it's too late, before the seed bank dies in the bud bank. In terms of species we see typically in these remnant grasslands, little bluestem and Indian grass are in all the sites. They are really important components of Piedmont grasslands, as well as Elliott's bluestem. That's a real beautiful one. And you can see I've put an asterisk by several of these names. That means that the seeds are not available from commercial sellers. So that's a preview for the next part of the presentation. We see a lot of smalls ragwort, curly heads, green milkweed, and narrowleaf mountain mint. And we found 13 species of rare plants in these sites, including two globally rare mountain mints, Torrey's mountain mint and Basil mountain mint. And the early false foxglove is worth mentioning. This species, unfortunately, is now extinct in Virginia. It was last seen in a Piedmont prairie in Prince William County that got paved over. And this plant is globally vulnerable. So obviously, we're trying to shine a light on these habitats and spread the word about how rich and important they are, and also irreplaceable they are, and prevent further extirpations like this. Now, nobody has done formal research on insects or other animals in remnant prairies in Virginia, but just during our research, we bumped into quite a few rare species like this carabid beetle, this digger bee, and northern oak hairstreaks. And these sites are small, and so they're not suitable for grassland birds like grasshoppers, sparrows, and meadowlarks, but there are a lot of prairie warblers and other declining shrubland birds in these remnant prairies. Unfortunately, during our study, we observed a bunch of threats. So we saw that two rare plant populations got sprayed by herbicide during our study. And also, these places are being abused in various ways. They're having pipelines put through them. And then when the soil is disturbed, they plant fescue. The guys are working and cutting the tree branches so they don't fall on the power lines, but then they make these huge piles of debris on top of the rare plants. When they need to replace the power poles, they put planks over the site and leave it for a year, which is not good for the plants. There's just a general lack of understanding about these sites and indifference once we inform them in most cases, unfortunately. And so a big priority of ours is to improve the management of these remnant prairies because they're very rich and they're irreplaceable. And you can't simply collect the seeds from them and plant a new remnant prairie somewhere else. So that's a big priority of ours. But in addition to saving the remnants, there's a big opportunity for restoration. And this is more approachable, for most landowners. You probably don't have a remnant prairie on your property. Maybe you do. A few people do. Um, but you probably do have a crappy patch of fescue where you'd like to plant some flowers. But so here's a big opportunity for all of us. If you are interested in planting a wildflower meadow, if you use the right species and ideally the right genetics, well, actually, critically, the right genetics, you're not going to be just planting pretty flowers. You're going to be doing restoration and connecting up fragmented plant populations. So that brings me to our seed project. So you noticed as I went through a lot of those plant species, a lot of them were not available from seed companies. So if you are interested in doing a restoration, you can't do it if you can't buy the seeds. So we got interested in this topic and got together with several partners to launch the Virginia Native Seed Project. In addition to the species not being available of any ecotype, the ones that are available are usually have genetics from other states, and so they bloom at the wrong time of year, which is a big problem for specialist pollinators. In addition, there's several studies now showing that plants with local genetics just do better. And this is a study from switchgrass that went from Texas all the way to Michigan. They collected seeds across this gradient and planted seedlings of three ecotypes along that gradient. And they found, not surprisingly, that the northern ecotype survived the winter better. And they also found that all three of the ecotypes grew better. They produced more biomass and grew faster if they were planted near where they were collected. So this is if you are interested in having a successful wildflower meadow, or if you're the Department of Transportation and you want to have a planting that takes, it's important to use local ecotypes. The hard part is that it's going to cost more money to produce those seeds, so we have to be ready to pay for this important service. There's a lot of demand in the landowner community for these seeds, as well as public lands managers around here. And there's also potentially going to be a lot of demand from big players like departments of transportation and industrial scale solar farms. Again, the cost is going to be an issue there. That's something we've got to figure out. The deal is that um, if you plant a local ecotype, it's just not going to produce as much seed per acre as a cultivar that's been selected and bred over many years. And that's something we're not going to overcome. So we're going to have to pay more for this premium. So for our project, as well as other seed projects in neighboring states, we collect seeds from the wild, then we grow seedlings in the greenhouse, and we give the seedlings to farmers who plant crops for seed production. And we got a conservation innovation grant, which enabled us to hire Isaac Matlock. He was our project coordinator until that funding ran out in October. It also enabled us to build a new greenhouse. And we're working with master naturalists to collect wild seeds across the state. We have 32 species right now in the project. These are common and attractive species that are widespread across Virginia. Um, and we're growing, as I mentioned, some species that have not been sold before, as well as some reliable species, but we're just growing them with Virginia genetics. Here's just a few of them: field thistle, yellow false indigo, helmet skullcap, swamp milkweed, Maryland gold nester, and small ragwort. So far, we have 8 farmers who have planted about a quarter acre each, and the plants grow really well. You know, they're local ecotype plants. They're adapted to their environment. Um, and we've gotten a couple of good harvests the last 2 winters, last 2 falls and winters. And we're working closely with Ernst Seeds on this. They've been really helpful with giving us a lot of advice and also donating a lot of their time to teach us and to clean the seeds. And so we've done a couple of tours up to Ernst with our farmers to learn more about the business. But you probably heard the but coming. We have a long way to go. So we need more money and more infrastructure. No surprise there. It's really hard to get a complicated project like this. Well, it's impossible to get a project like this set up in 2 years. We're off to a good start, but we need another like 3-year grant to keep this project going. The farmers need a lot of support. This is a new crop that we all have to learn how to grow it in Virginia. You know, the technology that's used in Pennsylvania or Florida probably won't apply here. And so we do have to develop new methods as well. And we're coming up this year, a big priority of ours is to come up with a business plan for the next 5 years and look long term how this project is going to be viable. We're studying projects from other states like Arkansas and Connecticut to see what works and what doesn't. And, we need these local ecotype seeds in every state, but the market forces are against us. And it's going to be a lot of work, and we have to change our expectations about the price of these seeds. Okay, so now on to the grassland restoration experiment. And I'm going to talk about our experimental restoration of fescue fields, and then talk a bit about the role of the native seed bank. So I've talked a lot about fescue. There's 50 million acres of it. We got, it's bad for wildlife. So it would be nice to convert some of it to native plants. But there actually hasn't been that much research on how to do that. So there's one study from the Southeast that found, in their case, it was from Texas and Kentucky, Tennessee and Kentucky. And they found that a single spray of herbicide in the winter to kill the fescue and release the native seed bank and allow it to germinate, that was the most effective treatment. And it was also 4 times cheaper than planting seeds. So that's a really interesting result. That's one of the treatments we wanted to test here in Virginia. And our goals, we wanted to maximize native plant richness, minimize non-native plants. We wanted to try to create communities that were as similar as possible to remnant grasslands. And we also looked at soils, and we wanted to compare soils of fescue fields to remnant prairies and see if the restoration made them more similar to the remnants or not. There's been little work on soils and native grasslands in the east, so we didn't really know what to expect. But based on work in the tallgrass prairies, we predicted that the remnants would have high soil carbon and high microbial biomass. So this is one of our sites, a 100-acre former fescue cattle pasture at Clifton. And I'll walk you through the treatment. So here, this is the control. So we did no establishment treatment here. And the western half, we mow once a year to keep it as a field. And the eastern half, we do a prescribed burn to keep it as a field. So we call those the management treatments. Next is the spray and leave treatment. So this is like what I described from that other study, a single application of glyphosate in November to kill the fescue and allow the native seed bank to express itself. And then we burn half and we mow half to keep it as a field. Then the spray and seed treatment. This is the standard NRCS recommendation. So this is 3 applications of glyphosate with planting cover crops in between. And finally, planting a diverse mix of wildflowers and grasses with a seed drill. And then we looked at an organic alternative. This is plowing and repeated disking to get rid of the fescue and other non-native plants. And then finally, we planted with the same seed mix with the seed drill. And we did this project with our partners, VWL and the Oak Spring Garden Foundation at SCBI and at Oak Spring. Our research questions: how do plants and soils of fescue fields, those are the baseline experimental plots, compare to those of remnant prairies? Do fescue fields become more similar to remnants after restoration? Which restoration treatment leads to the most improvement? And do fescue fields have useful seed banks? So we did a ton of plant surveys out there. And we also did a lot of soil sampling. So we dug 10 holes in each treatment. And then we sent them off to a couple different labs to get 28 chemical and microbial variables. So we have a really comprehensive description of the soil. And this is what the spray and seed treatment looked like in 2023. So you can take a look. So there's a lot of crown beard, definitely more crown beard than would be ideal, but it's a native plant. There's some ironweed, that's a good one. And there's also some chicory, which is a non-native plant. That's the blue flowers. So mixed bag, mostly native plants, and not looking much like a remnant grassland. And to look at it in more detail, we find that about 50% of the plants in these restored fields are native. And that doesn't compare well to the remnant grasslands, where, as a reminder, we had 86% of the plants were native. Also, the overall diversity was real lower, 269 species compared to 737. Now, this is not exactly comparing apples to apples because we sample more remnant sites, but we can see that we have a long way to go in terms of restoring a remnant-like community. And now to look at each treatment and how it responded. On the y-axis is the number of native species, and the different boxes are showing the different treatments, where the blue is the control, the green is the spray and leave, orange is spray and seed, and the 2 little dashes are till and seed. And then the hatched boxes show burn treatments, and the open boxes show mow. And so you can see in 2019, not surprisingly, before we did anything, they were all similar. And then after the treatments, you can see that they actually all improved, including the control, improved in terms of native plant species richness. We also see a couple of important things. So we see that the organic treatment and the spray and seed treatment were the most effective at establishing native plants. We also see that the spray and leave was no more effective than the control. And we see that there was no difference between burning and mowing. And now to look at some soil results, here we're comparing the baseline experimental plots, the fescue fields, in the light green boxes to the remnant prairies in the dark green boxes. And this is for the nutrients, for nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. We see that the remnant prairies had lower nutrients than the fescue fields. We would expect this from agricultural habitats. We also see, not surprisingly, that remnant prairies are more acidic than fescue pastures. Fescue pastures are getting limed by farmers to increase the pH and help the fescue grow. But then we start to see things we didn't expect. So this is soil carbon. We found significantly lower soil carbon in the remnant prairies compared to the fescue fields. We were also surprised to see lower bacterial and fungal biomass in the remnant prairies compared to the fescue fields. This is really weird. So the remnant prairies are hyper diverse, and you would expect, in terms of plants, you would expect that there would be a lot of biomass and different species of fungi and bacteria in the soil as well. I'm not showing the diversity index here, but we also saw that there was not higher diversity of bacteria or fungi in the remnants. So this is weird. And then to look at the effects of the experimental treatments on the soil, we saw an increase in fungal biomass in 3 treatments, but no other significant effects. And so as a reminder, that's only one of the 28 variables showed any changes at all. So overall, we saw very little effect of the experimental treatments on soils. It may take longer to see those. And we also found that the fescue fields did not become more similar to the remnants in terms of soils. But why the weird results? So this is a photo of a soil profile from a tallgrass prairie. This is derived from limestone. It has a deep, rich soil that stores a lot of carbon. And this is a soil profile from Clevenger's Corner. This got cut by a bulldozer and used to be a nice grassland there, not anymore. But you can see that there's not as much carbon in that soil. So, again, like we used the tallgrass prairies as the only basis of our predictions, but you can see that it doesn't make sense in this case. But like I mentioned, we're puzzled by the microbes. There ought to be more microbes in these remnant prairies, but there aren't. And so that's something we're still trying to figure out. Okay, and on to the seed bank. So our high school student, Rachel Harrington from Fauquier High in 2019, before we did any of the experimental treatments, she collected soil samples from all the treatments at Clifton, and she sowed them into trays and put them in the greenhouse. And you can see we had a big response. There were plenty of viable seeds in the soil. And we wanted to know, first of all, is anything good coming up? So are there desirable meadow plants in the seed bank? And we also wanted to know if there was an easier way of doing this. Could doing plant surveys tell us what's in the seed bank instead of having to go to all this work? This took Rachel an entire semester to do this project. So this graph is showing some of our results. On the y-axis is a proportion of samples where that plant species was present. And the yellow bars are showing seedlings that germinated from soil samples. And you can see red clover, Indian tobacco, black-eyed Susan, fleabane, oxeye daisy, ragweed. And yes, black-eyed Susan is nice. We put that in seed mixes, but it's not exactly what we were hoping for. And unfortunately, red clover is not native. So this is a pretty underwhelming result. We're not seeing desirable species in the seed bank, unfortunately. And the other thing we observed, the green bars is showing the standing vegetation. So this is the plants that we see out there during a plant survey. We see that it's dominated by a totally different group of species: horse nettle, coralberry, fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, and crownbeard, all of which were rare or absent in the seed bank. And nimblewill, which is Muhlenbergia schreiberi, is the only exception where it was common in the seed bank and also in the standing vegetation. So unfortunately, plant surveys are not going to do this job for us. We have to go out and see what seeds are in the soil. All right, so that's a lot of results. I'm going to summarize it for you. The restoration treatments did not achieve the diversity of remnant prairies, um, which we didn't expect, but you can hope. So we didn't get to remnants, but we did create a lot of good habitat for pollinators, and we achieved so far 50% native plant cover. So it's a really good start. The spray and seed and the till and seed treatments were the most effective for establishing native plants. And this is not a big surprise when you consider the seed bank results that I just presented. We also saw minimal effects of the restoration treatments on the soils, unfortunately. And there was no difference between burning or mowing for plants or for soils. And now this photo is showing a prescribed burn from the experimental plots at Clifton. This is really exciting, 60 acres. It takes a lot of training and a lot of time to learn how to do this. We had to get grants to get equipment to enable us to do this safely. Um, But unfortunately, fire is not a way to establish a meadow on fescue. So fire does create good habitat for quail and native bees. Most of our native bees nest in the ground and they require bare ground. Quail also need bare ground. They can't deal with a lot of thatch. So fire is really helpful for those two species. So it's a great management tool. Once you have a native grassland, fire is great, but it's not a way of converting a fescue field into a native meadow. Okay, so I'm going to finish up with some practical advice based on our research. So whenever you're doing a restoration project or any kind of planting project, we always recommend that you think about what the goal is and you establish your goal based on a high quality example of your plant community that's found nearby. And we're lucky in Virginia, we have some really good resources that help us identify plants and also look at plant communities so that we can establish goals for restoration projects. The first is the Flora Virginia app. This enables you to identify any plant in Virginia. And related to that is the digital atlas of the Virginia flora. That is a map that shows the occurrence of each plant species at a county level. So you can quickly see if the plant you're thinking about even is found in your county or not. That really helps to narrow it down. You might find a new county record. That's unusual though in most counties. And the other thing we have is that the Department of Conservation and Recreation has done a huge amount of work to survey the plant communities of Virginia and to describe every major plant community in the state. And so if you learn what your geology is and your soil type, then you can look through their catalog of plant communities and figure out what a high quality example would look like. So that enables you to set your goal. Now, this may sound like a lot of work, and maybe this is not your idea of a good time. I actually find it to be really rewarding, and it's a challenge. We have so many plant species in Virginia. But we're here to help. So if you need help defining the goal of your project or coming up with a seed mix, we are happy to help and just send Kadira an email. And when you're doing a project on your land, of course, it's going to be a balance between achieving something that's beautiful and planting stuff that is totally 100% appropriate for your site. But to push back on that idea a little bit, this is our planting in our side bed at Clifton, and this is 100% locally collected species that we've used for the side bed, and it achieved a really pretty result. So you can have nice aesthetics using local plants. How to begin a new meadow project? The first step is to let it grow up. This is key. So you want to see if you have a native grassland, a degraded field, or a non-native field. And, unfortunately, there are a few examples in our region of places that got sprayed and replanted, but it turns out that they were a remnant grassland to start with. So you really want to avoid that. Hopefully I've made that point already. Now, in native grassland, we're calling native grasslands as places that have at least 90% native plants. And if you have a site like this, the recommendation is to burn or mow it every year or every other year in February or March. So we're into that season now. You're going to have to control non-natives, even in a really nice field like this. Um, and if it's not pretty enough for it, you can supplement it with additional plantings. But if you have a nice native field like this, it's all the more important to use plants or seeds that have local genetics. And Earth Sangha, the nursery in Fairfax, they have a huge selection of local ecotype plants that you can use for projects like these. And it's important to remember that it may not be the whole field. So, again, there may be like a back corner where there's lots of nice natives, and you don't want to just do a blanket treatment across the field without looking at it, letting it grow up first. And just a couple examples. So this is a field, one of our board members, this is her field, and she wanted to plant a beautiful meadow. But we let it grow up and it turned out she already had a bunch of awesome native plants. And this plant, lyre-leaf sage, you can't get that with Virginia genetics from any seed seller. So she's got it already. And now this is a seed source for us. We're collecting seeds from these sages for our project. This is another example of an unplanted grassland, a local landowner. And here, this just shows you that it gives a lot of winter interest as well. So, November to January, the little blue stem is really beautiful. And, there was nothing planted here. These are just the native plants that were already there. And I think part of our job also is rethinking the aesthetics a little bit. Everybody hates tall grass, but look at this beautiful tall grass. And, it doesn't have to be mowed to be beautiful. Okay, the second category of field is a degraded field. This is one that's a mix of native and non-native plants. And here you're definitely going to have to control the non-natives, and you may or may not have to plant natives. If you have three-quarters native plants, we recommend trying a single spray of herbicide in the winter, either clethodim, which is a grass-specific herbicide, or glyphosate. Um, and this can work well. So if you already have a lot of native plants and you just want to get the non-native cool season plants out of the way, this is a viable method. Now, it didn't work in our experiment. If you remember, it was no better than the control. And that's because we didn't have three-quarters native plants to begin with. Our experimental sites were degraded agricultural fields, and a single spray just didn't work in that situation. Because what it did was it killed the fescue, but then allowed all the other weeds to come in. And just a note there that, yeah, that if you don't have to plant, it's going to save you a lot of money. This is an example from Fairfax County of a project where they just got rid of the non-natives, didn't plant anything, and they had a really beautiful result. But no, unfortunately, a lot of projects are going to be like this, where you truly have all non-natives, and you're going to have to do 3 sprays of herbicide or an aggressive organic alternative. And this is one possible schedule. It's important to talk to an expert, so somebody from like NRCS, or we can come out and take a look at it and give you advice on how to plant your meadow. This is one possible schedule, and I won't get into the details now. You can plant in the fall or spring, and there are pros and cons of doing either. The seeds are going to stratify naturally if you plant in the fall, but you're going to lose seeds from rain and sparrows and mold. And not surprisingly for the seed mix, this is, I think, the most important decision that you're going to make. So you want to pick species that are native to your county, and that match high quality habitats near you. But as I've mentioned, there are really limited sources of these available now. We're going to start selling seeds on a really limited basis this summer. But in the meantime, what we've done is that we look and see what plants are native to our county. We come up with a list, and then we buy seeds that have out-of-state genetics. Right now, we see that as the best compromise. And it's important that you mow it in the first year, mow it high to control the weeds in the first year. Organic alternative, I've talked about repeated disking. There are other methods like black plastic or heavy grazing that have promise but have not been well tested. And some of them are hard to scale up. Why do meadow plantings fail? Non-native competition. So here's a beautiful stand of Johnson grass, and this is obviously what you want to avoid. So you really have to do your homework and control the non-natives before you plant your precious seeds. Okay, and so I'm going to close here with a few recommendations on some of our favorite plants that provide the resources that we're trying to get out there. You want to plant things that bloom from spring till fall. You want to provide pollen as well as nectar. And pollen sources for generalist bees, important pollen sources are penstemon, senna, partridge pea, baptisia, and native thistles. And for specialist bees, it's really important to plant goldenrods, native sunflowers, and asters. There's a whole bunch of bees that can only use those three genera of plants. And pollen in general is important to remember. So most meadow plantings in the past have not done a good job at providing pollen. So something we need to do going forward. And a lot of this is based on research by Dave Carr and Ty Rolston at Blandy. They've been collecting pollen from bees so they can see how good of a job we're doing at providing the resources. Nectar is also important, and we love mountain mints, wild bergamot, eupatorium that provides late season resources, as well as milkweeds. What not to plant, you won't be surprised that I don't advocate planting species that are not native to the state, like purple coneflower. Nothing wrong with having some purple coneflowers around the house, but if you're doing a restoration project or a big meadow planting, that's when it's important to stick to locally appropriate species. So I'd like to thank the Rains Family Fund and the Band Foundation, as well as all the other donors listed here, and a whole bunch of people who helped us in the field. So thank you all very much. I'm glad to take some questions. Looking at the chat here. Q&A seems to be working. Okay, excellent. So Juan says, I often hear that some savanna seed banks are waiting for disturbance. Do folks have any sense how long these seed banks can survive? Yeah, so we don't know. This is something that keeps us awake at night because the clock really is ticking, um, but we don't know. Hopefully decades. Sue says, I had the opportunity to tour Ernst Seeds. It was amazing. I used to be related to Calvin Ernst. He has about 10,000 acres. Yes. Yeah. So we have been, like I said, like I talked about, we've been to Ernst and they're working with us a lot, which is great. Has there been any investigation into doing topsoil transfers from remnant prairies facing destruction to restoration sites? Do plants survive and can they expand into the restored areas around them? So yes, it has been done. Prairie rescue, you can take a sod cutter and you can roll it up and move it somewhere else. Um, I'm not aware of that being done in Virginia. And it's obviously a last resort move, but yeah, something we unfortunately need to consider. And especially if there are rare plants there. And it should work. Miriam says the Washington Post had an article about establishing meadows. Seems like a crazy amount of work and effort. Yes. Is that just an outlier? Or can the backyard meadow, so can it be beneficial? Well, I think there's two questions there. Yes, it's a ton of work, but it's expensive. But it is really rewarding. So I love going out in meadows in the summer and seeing what pollinators come. I planted a meadow at my house here 7 years ago, and there are species that are popping up now from the mix. It's the first time I've seen them. So every year it's different in a meadow, which is really exciting. You never know what you're going to get. And so, it's very rewarding personally, but it's also providing a lot of habitat. We found several rare pollinators coming to meadows that we planted. So yes, the backyard meadow is definitely beneficial. Heather says, good to get an update from you all about the research and the recommendations. They inform me. Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear it. That's useful. Any other questions? Nothing heard. Okay. Well, thank you all very much and hope to see you soon out at Clifton. Oh, wait, I'm seeing some more here. If you're still with us, we do not charge. These are free visits. The recording will be available. We'll send that to y'all. Yep. Okay. Good night.